My name is Walter Green, and the night my daughter forgot to mute her phone was the night my life cracked wide open. I was sitting in my kitchen scraping the last of Margaret's old meatloaf recipe from my plate. Mine never turned out quite right without her touch, too dry, too heavy, but it was habit now, a comfort ritual more than a meal. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steady, as it had for 20 years, and the scent of lemon oil from polishing the counters still clung faintly to the air. The phone rang. My heart always lifted when I saw Laura's name. She was my only child after all. Her voice at first was warm, like honey, Dad. How are you holding up? I leaned back in Margaret's recliner, worn smooth from her reading evenings. Oh, you know me, sweetheart. Just finished dinner. Might catch the news in a bit. I didn't mention it was leftovers from 3 nights ago, or that I'd been staring at Margaret's photograph on the mantel for an hour. Some things are easier, kept quiet. Laura laughed lightly, the way she always did when she wanted to move the conversation along. She asked if I was eating enough, reminded me I could order groceries online. I told her I was fine, that I'd had a scare forgetting to turn off the coffee pot yesterday. Her voice faltered, and I pictured the crease between her brows, the same one her mother had when she worried. Dad, maybe we should talk about getting someone to check in on you more often. Before I could answer, her husband's muffled voice floated in the background, reminding her of dinner with clients. She ended our call with, "Love you, Dad. Take care of yourself." I smiled, whispered it back. Then I heard it. Rustling, the shuffle of a phone being dropped into a purse, and then voices no longer warm, no longer careful. David's voice, sharp, practical. He won't even notice when we sell the place. He's slipping. Laura's voice, stripped of sweetness. The house is worth close to $1 million. We could use that for Boulder, the one with the mountain view. He'll think we're just helping. Something inside me froze. My hand hovered over the receiver pulse, hammering. They laughed, my daughter, the child Margaret and I had sacrificed for, laughed as they planned my exile. I didn't say a word. Not then. I sat in the dim kitchen as the walls seemed to lean closer, as though the house itself were listening. Margaret's photo stared at me from the mantel, eyes unreadable, warning disappointment, or maybe just the quiet knowledge of the dead. I remembered the night she made me promise not to let anyone take advantage. You're too generous, Walt, too trusting. Don't let them take everything from you. That promise had been gathering dust like so many memories. Until now. I rose slowly, my knees aching, and crossed to the drawer where I kept old receipts and papers. Beneath them was a business card Margaret had insisted we keep after her diagnosis, Samuel Collins, attorney at law. She had wanted everything in order back then. I hadn't needed it until tonight. I turned the card in my hand, its edges worn from years of being moved but never used. My fingers curled into fists the way they did when I swung hammers in my construction days. They think I won't notice, I whispered to the empty room. The grandfather clock ticked on, steady, unfazed. Outside, spring crickets chirped in the garden Margaret once tended. But inside me, something harder had settled, cold, clear. I kept it to myself. I ate my last bite of meatloaf in silence, set the fork down with deliberate calm, and looked around the house my house built board by board, nail by nail with my own hands. Every corner carried Margaret's fingerprints, every floorboard carried my sweat. And they thought I wouldn't notice? No, they would notice. They would notice every single detail when the locks didn't turn. Tomorrow I would make my first call. I barely slept. The house had a way of humming at night pipes, settling the fridge, clicking on the far-off hush of cars along Maple Avenue. I lay awake, listening to it breathe, remembering how Margaret used to whisper, "Listen, Walt, old houses talk." Ours tells us we did all right. By dawn, I was at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, a ballpoint pen, and 2 cups of coffee that tasted like determination. The cabinet over my left shoulder held the drawer I'd ignored for years, warranties, tax folders, a sliver of our life in stapled packets. I tugged it open and set down a stack thick enough to tilt the table. There they were, receipts. The first I pulled free was sun-faded and crinkled along the edges, University of Colorado tuition meal plan dorm deposit. I could see myself counting the numbers 20 years ago, with plaster dust still clinging to my eyelashes from a double shift. I remembered coming home after midnight, boots thudding on the back steps, Margaret already setting a mug by the sink, steam curling like a blessing. "We'll make it work," I'd told her then, even though the math said otherwise. And we did. Overtime in August, overtime in January. Cutting and installing crown molding for other people's living rooms when my own wrists already burned. Every semester we slid another cashier's check across a bursar's counter and smiled as if it didn't cost a year off my back. I laid those receipts in a neat pile on the table. The paper made a tired, papery sigh, like it remembered too. Next came the wedding binder, white vinyl with a broken zipper stuffed with invoices. Banquet hall deposit. Photographer. Florist. There was a handwritten note from the seamstress pinned to an invoice with a pearl-headed pin rush hem by Friday. I swallowed hard. We had told Laura we could manage a modest ceremony, simple and beautiful. She cried on the phone, said she'd dreamed of a big ballroom chandelier's live band, the whole county staring while we danced. I didn't want her to feel small in the eyes of anyone, not once in her life. So I made possible what felt impossible. That spring my hands ached so bad at night, I'd sleep with them wrapped in Margaret's heating pad. Sunday evenings I'd go to the garage and sand the coffee table I was building for our living room, sawdust soft as flour in the light, the radio low with ball games and voices I'd grown old with. Margaret would lean in the doorway with iced tea. "Don't forget your wrists," she'd say, always the nurse, even if she had no degree. The invoices teased a smile out of me. God, we were proud that day. Laura in lace. The band struck up something Motown and folks formed a circle around us while we tried to remember the steps we'd practiced in the kitchen. During the father-daughter dance, Laura whispered, "You're the best, Dad." My throat had closed around the words I wanted to say. Just don't forget gratitude. Maybe I should have said it anyway. Further down, a service invoice transmission for David's BMW. 3,000 and change, a number that rang today like a bell I'd ignored. He'd slapped my shoulder at the barbecue a week later and told his buddies I was the most generous man he knew. I had believed him. It's easy to believe praise when you're exhausted and proud. I took a breath and stood, letting my hand trail along the countertop granite Margaret chose. We'd visited 5 warehouses, walked through aisles of stone, like tourists in a cathedral. She fell in love with this one speckled gray with fine gold veins that caught morning light like stitched sunlight. "This one looks like coffee with cream under church windows," she'd said, touching it with reverence. I measured twice, and then twice again installed it in pieces, so clean the seams went invisible. The day we finished, Margaret brewed a pot of coffee we couldn't afford, and we christened the counter by letting the mugs leave rings that we wiped away together. The floorboards under my feet creaked in their familiar notes, long runs of 3/4 oak I'd glued and nailed in 2001. The smell of oil soap lived between the boards the way summer lives between screen door and porch. Every line here had been chosen, every inch finished by hand. I could point with my eyes closed to the dip where Laura scooted her toy truck until the varnish needed re-rubbing to the faint stain from cranberry sauce, the year the cousins came during the snowstorm. I drifted to the bay window. My fingerprints were still visible in the joints if you knew where to look. Margaret had seen it in a magazine Sun pouring into a small reading throne, and said if we couldn't afford Italy, we could still have that. I taught myself angles I hadn't cut before. Spent evenings on my knees with shims leveling with a stubbornness that made Margaret shake her head and set out a cushion under me. And in that window I saw a reflection I didn't like, a man who'd been content to be grateful for the scraps of his own generosity. I pressed my palm to the wood. No more, I told the empty room. Back at the table, I stacked tax returns proud and messy with handwritten notes. Our deed, my name alone now. The day Margaret died, the title transferred automatically, a cold line on a warm day. The attorney back then had explained it gently. Samuel Collins, his card felt heavier in my pocket than it should have. I traced my name with a finger as if I were checking for defects in a seam. Clean. Uncontested. Not a single piece of paper on this table had Laura's signature. Not a one. This house was inked in our sweat, not her expectations. I reached into a shallow folder and pulled out photographs Margaret had arranged me waist-deep in a trench, grinning like an idiot under a hard hat. The guys from the crew leaning on Shovel's son in our squint Margaret, and a ridiculous paper visor bringing lemonade. In one, she's not looking at the camera at all, just at me, eyes crinkled, convinced in some private way that our life would hold. The furnace clicked on. The ducts carried warm air that barely smelled like metal anymore. It smelled like us, like books and lemon oil and years. I closed my eyes and could hear Margaret's feet on the stairs. The hush of a bath being run. The clatter of Laura's backpack when she'd come home from school spelling tests slapped to the fridge with magnets shaped like fruit. People think revenge is hot. It isn't. It's a decision that cools inside you until it's the exact temperature of the room. Mine felt cool now. Level, almost professional. I wrote 3 headings across the top of my legal pad: attorney, broker, bank. Underneath, I made smaller lists: attorney title check, sale timeline, conditions, storage liability, any letters that need careful language. Broker cash buyers, comps, days on market, possession terms, professional photographer, disclosures clean. Bank new account, wire, 2-factor, beneficiary update, safe deposit box. And beneath everything I added, note. The one they would read when their suitcase wheels rattled across oak I'd laid with these hands. I took a slow tour of the house with a blue painter's tape roll in my pocket, tagging the few things that would go with me: Margaret's jewelry box, the wedding album, the cookbook with her notes in the margins: less sugar, use real vanilla, Walt likes extra nutmeg. The rest could stay. Furniture has a way of looking like memory until it's just wood again. I wouldn't fight the wood. I'd fight expectations. Outside, the morning widened into a pale Colorado sky. Across the street, old Mr. Hadley dragged his garbage bin to the curb, pausing to rub his back. He raised a hand. I raised mine. Maple Avenue was waking, and for once I felt awake with it. I put on a clean shirt, and the jacket Margaret never let me throw out because it makes you look like a gentleman, and I slid Samuel Collins's card into my wallet. In the hallway mirror, a man looked back with lines deeper than last year, eyes a little red jaw set. Not a brawler's jaw. A carpenter's, someone who measured cut and fit until the joint closed tight without forcing. I locked the door behind me and felt for the first time since the phone call the floor steady under my feet. The next morning I drove into town with the steady determination of a man who had already made up his mind. Denver's spring sun glared off the hood of my old Chevy, and as I guided it down Colfax Avenue, I thought of all the years I'd made this drive for work, never once imagining I'd be here to protect my life's work from my own daughter. The sign for Collins and Associates Attorneys at Law came into view on a modest brick building sandwiched between a florist shop and a family dentist. It wasn't flashy, but Margaret had trusted this man once, and that was good enough for me. I parked out front, tugged at the cuffs of my shirt, the one she used to say made me look put together, and walked inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather, with a low hum of classical music floating through the speakers. I settled into a chair that sighed under my weight, clutching the folder of documents I'd pulled from home. The deed, my tax returns, the receipts that told the story of decades of sacrifice. A young receptionist with neat hair and quick fingers tapped something into her computer before smiling up at me. Mr. Green, Mr. Collins will see you now." I stood adjusting my jacket and followed her down a hallway lined with framed degrees and photographs of Denver in sepia tones. At the end was an office with shelves bowing under the weight of law books and a large oak desk scattered with files. Behind it sat Samuel Collins, a man in his mid-50s with streaks of gray at his temples and kind but tired eyes. He stood when I entered, extending a firm hand. "Mr. Green, I remember meeting you and your wife years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." The mention of Margaret tightened my chest, but I nodded. "Thank you." She thought ahead more than I ever did. "That's why I'm here." He gestured for me to sit, pouring coffee into a pair of mismatched mugs. One had the logo of the University of Denver. The other said "World's Okayest Lawyer." That small touch disarmed me. "So what brings you in today?" I laid the deed on the desk, smoothing it out like a carpenter setting a plan. "I overheard something last night," I began slowly, my voice low and measured. "My daughter and her husband. They were talking about selling my house, about putting me in a nursing home so they could take the money." Collins leaned back, steepling his fingers. He didn't look shocked, just disappointed, like he'd heard too many stories of betrayal before. "Do they have any legal claim to the property?" "No." I shook my head firmly. "This deed is in my name alone. Always has been. Bought the land in '99, built the place myself. After Margaret passed, it transferred fully to me. No co-signers, no trusts." "Then they can't sell it, Mr. Green. They can't force you into any facility either. Legally, your assets are yours." Relief washed over me, but it was sharp, almost bitter. I clenched my hands around the coffee mug. "Then I want to sell it myself. Before they try anything. I want this done quickly. Cash, if possible." Collins studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether I was acting out of anger or clarity. "Are you certain, once it's sold, there's no undoing it?" I met his gaze. "I built that house with my own hands. But it's just lumber and stone now. What matters is showing them I'm not some helpless old man they can manage like a piece of property." He nodded slowly, pulling a yellow legal pad closer. "All right, here's how we proceed. We can list it with a reputable broker who works with cash buyers. Given the Denver market, I'd estimate a sale in under 2 weeks, possibly much sooner if priced aggressively. You'll need a new account to receive the funds, preferably at a smaller bank with stronger privacy controls. I can recommend one." I scribbled notes as he spoke, my carpenter's handwriting blocky but steady. He continued, "Now, if you'd like, I can also draft a letter, something formal that makes clear your intentions. You don't have to share it, but sometimes having things in writing helps in case there are confrontations." The word settled heavy between us. I pictured Laura's face when she realized what I'd done, the way her smile would falter, the way David's temper might flash. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll need that letter, but I also have my own." Collins raised a brow. "Your own?" I leaned back in my chair, eyes narrowing. "A note. For when they come back and find their keys don't work, they'll read it on the doorstep. And they'll know exactly what I heard and exactly what I did." For a moment, silence hung in the office. Then Collins gave a slow, approving nod. "You've thought this through." "All right, I'll handle the legal side. Do you have a broker in mind?" I shook my head. "Then I'll recommend one," he said, flipping through his Rolodex until he pulled out a card. "Brian Mitchell. Experienced, discreet, fast. He's closed deals in less than a week for investors. I'll make an introduction if you like." I took the card, the bold lettering of Brian Mitchell Real Estate Broker gleaming under the office light. "That'll do." We spent another hour combing through details. Collins explained closing costs, title searches, contingencies. I absorbed it all like blueprints. Every measurement, every cut, every fit had to be precise. When we finished, I tucked the deed and Collins's notes back into my folder, my resolve carved deeper than before. As I rose to leave, he said quietly, "Mr. Green, I know this is difficult. But sometimes protecting yourself is the greatest act of love for the life you built. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty. I paused in the doorway, Margaret's face flashing in my memory, the way she'd pressed my hand during our last days together, whispering, "Promise me you'll take care of yourself." "I won't," I said, "not anymore." The sunlight outside felt sharper, cleaner as I stepped back onto Colfax Avenue. In my wallet now were 2 cards: Samuel Collins, attorney; Brian Mitchell, real estate broker. Tools of a new kind of trade. I climbed into my Chevy, started the engine, and whispered to the dashboard, "Time to get to work." By the time I left Samuel Collins's office, the sun had climbed high, bleaching Colfax Avenue into a sheet of pale gold. The drive back home felt shorter, as if the city had shrunk around me. On the seat beside me lay Brian Mitchell's card, sharp corners pressing into the leather folder like a reminder the next step was mine to take. I didn't wait. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I dialed the number. A brisk, professional voice answered. "This is Brian Mitchell." "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Walter Green. Samuel Collins gave me your card. I'm interested in selling my house." There was a pause on the line, not of hesitation but of assessment. Brokers, I learned long ago, listen between words. "Of course, Mr. Green. Can you tell me a little about the property?" I looked up at the house, sunlight spilling across the bay window Margaret had loved so much. Built in 1999, original owner, Cherry Creek neighborhood, about 3,400 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. Well maintained. Another pause, sharper this time. "That's exactly the kind of listing I specialize in. Would you be open to a property assessment? I could be there this afternoon." I swallowed. My house assessed like a patient under cold lights. But this was the plan. 3 o'clock. When he arrived, Brian Mitchell looked every bit the professional early 40s, sharp suit, leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He had the alert eyes of a man who knew how to spot value and how to sell it fast. "Mr. Green," he said warmly, shaking my hand, "let's take a look." As he stepped inside, his gaze darted from the oak floors to the crown molding from the granite counters to the seamless flow between rooms. He didn't bother hiding his appreciation. "You weren't kidding about maintenance," he murmured, running a hand along the countertop. "These floors original install." "Every board," I replied. "Laid them myself in 2001. He crouched, tapping the wood with a practiced knuckle. "Solid. You'd be surprised how many homes this age already need refinishing. But this will sing in the listing photos." We walked through each room. My voice felt detached, almost clinical, as I recited details: custom cabinets, reinforced beams, the bay window. But inside every word pulled at a thread of memory. Margaret's laughter as she measured curtains. Laura's squeal when she unwrapped the dollhouse replica I built one Christmas. The soft sound of slippers across these very boards. Still, I kept my tone even. If I let sentiment slip, the plan might falter. Finally, we settled in the living room. Brian tapped on his tablet, pulling up recent comps. Similar homes in this neighborhood have closed between $850 and $920 in the past 3 months. Given the condition and unique features, I'd suggest we list at $890. That'll move quickly and still put you in the top bracket. $890,000. The number rolled through my head like thunder. Exactly the figure Laura and David had whispered about on the phone, as if my house were already theirs. "Cash buyers?" I asked. "I have several investors who'd line up for this property. They'll waive contingencies, pay above, asking if necessary. We could close in under 2 weeks." 2 weeks. That was all I needed to sell it out from under them before their smiles ever touched these walls again. "I'll do it," I said quietly. Brian smiled, professional and satisfied. "Excellent. I'll handle the paperwork. We'll need photographs, but I can have a photographer here tomorrow. In the meantime, I'll draft the listing." As he spoke, I imagined Laura's face when she slid her key into the lock and felt it refuse to turn. I pictured David's practiced calm cracking into panic as he realized their inheritance had slipped through their fingers. Brian gathered his things, promising contracts by morning. As he left, he paused at the doorway. "Mr. Green, I've sold a lot of houses, but I have to say this one feels different. It's got a story in the walls. Buyers will sense that. Trust me." I managed a tight smile. "Oh, it has a story, just not the one they think." After he drove off, I lingered in the living room. Evening light streamed through Margaret's bay window, turning the oak floors golden. I sank into her old recliner, the leather creaking softly, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This was no longer just a house, it was a stage, and I had set the first trap. I picked up my pen and began drafting the note, each word measured deliberate like the joints of a frame. "Laura and David, if you're reading this, it means your plan failed. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought you could sell my home behind my back, but I sold it myself for $890,000. The money is safe, and I am too. This house was never yours. It was built with my hands, with your mother's heart for a family that no longer exists. Consider this my final lesson: greed always locks you out." I placed the draft neatly on the table. Soon it would hang on the door, waiting for them like a verdict. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked its steady rhythm. Outside, the neighborhood quieted as porch lights blinked on. Inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. The morning of the photo shoot, I rose earlier than usual. Dawn hadn't yet stretched over Denver, but the house already hummed with its familiar aches and sighs. Today, strangers would arrive to capture its beauty, to turn our history into glossy images for investors who would never know the weight of the memories bound to these walls. I brewed coffee, the smell filling the kitchen Margaret once called her command center, and walked slowly from room to room. Dustcloth in hand, I polished surfaces that had long been familiar. My fingers lingered on the dining table where Laura had done her homework on the banister Margaret decorated each Christmas with pine garland. This wasn't for the photographer. This was ritual. A farewell tour disguised as chores. When the photographer arrived, a young woman named Kristen, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, she gasped at the natural light spilling through the bay window. "Mr. Green, this place is stunning. Buyers are going to fight over it." I smiled faintly. They won't be the only ones. She didn't notice the edge in my voice. She moved quickly, snapping wide shots of the kitchen close-ups of the crown molding careful frames of the hardwood floors. Each click of the shutter felt like a nail in a coffin, sealing 25 years of life into images that would circulate online by evening. By noon, Brian Mitchell called with updates. "The listing's live, Mr. Green. I already have 2 serious inquiries. Investors. They're prepared to make cash offers. Expect movement within days." Days turned out to be hours. By late afternoon, Brian was back on the phone, his voice practically buzzing. "I've got a buyer ready to close. Cash, no contingencies. Offer is $890,000. The exact figure Laura and David had whispered about like vultures. My jaw tightened. Accept it. And just like that, the house was no longer mine. The title company moved with a speed I hadn't thought possible. Within 48 hours, inspectors shuffled through, murmuring approval at the workmanship. One even whistled low when he saw the oak floors. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. I didn't bother to answer. On the 3rd day, the papers were ready. Brian met me at the title office, crisp suit, sharp pen, efficient as ever. The notary walked me through each page: settlement statement, deed transfer disclosure. I read every line the way I used to study blueprints, double-checking each detail. When the final signature dried, the notary smiled. "Congratulations, Mr. Green. The funds will be wired to your account today. $890,000. Real tangible. Mine. Safe." Brian shook my hand. "You made the right choice, Mr. Green. Sometimes a clean break is the best path forward." But this wasn't just a clean break. This was a cut, a deliberate severing of the cord Laura and David thought bound me to their plans. I drove home, or what was still for 30 days, legally my home feeling lighter than I had in months. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, the same rhythm as always, but it sounded different now. Less like comfort, more like a countdown. That night, I opened a bottle of Margaret's favorite wine, one I'd been saving for an occasion we never reached. I poured a glass, set it beside her photograph on the mantel, and whispered, "We did it, Maggie. They won't take this from us." But there was still work to do. I spent the next morning boxing the essentials, Margaret's jewelry box, the photo albums, the cookbook with her notes in the margins. The rest, the furniture, the dishes, the curtains, Margaret sewed by hand, would remain for the new owners. Objects are heavy. Memories are heavier. I could only carry what mattered most. When the boxes were stacked neatly by the door, I sat at the kitchen table with my legal pad and rewrote the note. It had to be perfect, sharp enough to pierce, measured enough to last. Laura and David, if you're holding this, it means you've returned expecting keys that no longer work. You spoke of me as a burden of this house as your payday. But this house was never yours. It was built with sweat and love, not entitlement. I sold it myself for $890,000. The money is safe beyond your reach. Consider this my parting gift, the lesson that greed locks doors while gratitude opens them. Dadestor. I copied the note in my cleanest script, folded it once, and slid it into an envelope. On the front, in deliberate block letters, I wrote, Laura and David. I taped it to the inside of the front door at eye level. They wouldn't miss it. As dusk fell, I stepped outside and looked back at the house one more time. The porch light flicked on automatically, casting a warm glow across the yard I'd mowed for decades. I knew every inch of this place, the spot where Laura scraped her knee, learning to ride a bike, the corner, Margaret filled with tulips each spring, the tree we strung with Christmas lights so bright the neighbors joked it could land planes. But tonight it wasn't home. Tonight it was a lesson waiting to be taught. I locked the door, slid the new keys into my pocket, and walked down the driveway with my box of essentials. My car door creaked open the same way it always had, but this time it felt like the door to freedom. As I drove away, the rearview mirror showed the house shrinking behind me, not disappearing, just receding like a chapter closed with firm hands. Tomorrow, Laura and David would come back from their trip, suitcase wheels rattling across oak floors that no longer belonged to them. They would find their keys useless. They would find my note. And for the first time in years, I would be somewhere they couldn't touch me. I parked 2 houses down beneath the shade of a maple, whose leaves had just turned that tender spring green, the kind that looks almost translucent when the sun leans through it. The engine ticked as it cooled. In the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee I didn't need, and a pair of work gloves I wouldn't use. My hands rested on the wheel, relaxed in a way that felt foreign, as if they belonged to another man, a younger man who knew what to do with a plan and a deadline. Maple Avenue dozed in the late afternoon. A dog across the street barked, once reconsidered, and flopped onto its porch. Mr. Hadley's wind chimes trembled when a breeze passed, giving off a careful, glassy music. Sun slid along the roofs and pooled in the gutters like warm honey. At 5:14, the familiar black SUV turned onto the block. I recognized the cautious way David drove, performing competence even at residential speed. He pulled into the driveway like he owned it. The feeling that rose in me wasn't anger. It was something quieter, almost elegiac, like hearing a song you loved once and finding it doesn't fit anymore. The doors thumped open. Laura unfolded from the passenger seat, smoothed her jacket, tilted her face to the light, as if this were a movie, and she was the star of the return. David hauled the suitcases out the wheels, clacking across the driveway before thumping onto the front step. Their voices reached me in snippets that mid-travel brightness people put on to disguise fatigue. "Home," Laura said softly, the word catching in the air. She dug in her purse. Her hand came out with the brass key I'd given her the day she married David, when I still believed keys meant belonging and not access. She slid it into the lock, twisted. The lock didn't move. I watched her mouth form a small, puzzled, "Huh." She tried again, harder this time, the way people do when they think effort can bully reality into compliance. "Maybe you're off a tooth," David said, setting the suitcases upright. "Let me." He took the key, tried his own, jiggled, lifted, leaned. The sound, a dull metal rasp, carried to the truck, a music I won't pretend I didn't recognize with satisfaction. David Laura said, a thin line of panic under the syllables. Why isn't it?" "These are new cylinders," he said, peering close. "The bevel's different." She stepped back as if the door had insulted her. "New locks." "That doesn't make any sense. My dad wouldn't. He doesn't even—" "He does," I said in my head. "He does now." David tried the side door. Nothing. He tested the garage keypad. It blinked dumbly and refused him as it should. He circled to the back porch, returned with his reason trimmed and his volume higher. "Everything's changed," he said. "This is intentional." Laura looked small then for the first time in years. It wasn't her height. It was the way her shoulders rounded as if a truth were settling on them and finding purchase. She pulled out her phone and dialed, holding it to her ear like a talisman. The number she called rang in a disconnected nowhere my old line cut days ago. She stared at the screen, disbelieving. "He's not answering," she said. "There's no voicemail." "Try his cell," David said, impatient. "He doesn't have a cell," she whispered almost to herself, and for a moment I heard the daughter who used to fling herself across the couch and declare the world unfair because the neighbor boy got a later curfew. She thumbed another contact, maybe the house phone again, or maybe habit dialing habit. Something hardened in her face. "I'm going around back," she said, already moving. "There's always that kitchen window that sticks." "No." David snapped, then moderated his tone as if he were instructing a client. "Breaking and entering is still breaking and entering." "It's my father's house," she said. She paused, caught herself, and the words fell apart in her mouth. It's... He moved past her, trying to take back control by making calculations in the air. "Let's check the mail slot. Maybe there's..." They both stopped at once. From where I sat, I could see the flash of white at eye level on the inside of the door. The envelope I'd taped there rode the afternoon light like a small sail. Laura and David, neat blocky in the hand that had sketched room additions and stair geometry, and the curve of a bay window Margaret wanted more than she wanted most things. David bent, peered through the pane. "There's something... taped." An envelope. He looked at Laura. For the first time since they'd stepped from the car, he looked unsure. "If we can get to the back window." But Laura was already moving, heels clacking along the walk around the house to the kitchen sill that had always stuck in winter and swelled in summer. I knew what she'd find, a latch I'd forgotten once, and never again. She wrestled it. It gave with a reluctant sigh. David hoisted her up, old choreography well practiced. She slid through awkwardly, skirt-catching purse, thumping onto the tile. A beat later, the front door clicked open from inside. David ushered in the suitcases, the performance of ownership writ in their hands. I rolled the window down a crack. It was enough to carry voices out into the quiet street. "What is this?" Laura said, the paper crackling. "Why would he—" Her voice dropped into a register I recognized as the lower end of the truth. She read. I didn't need line by line. I knew the words. I had measured them like I measure a cut that can't be uncut. "You spoke of me as a burden," she read, voice thinning. "This house was built with sweat and love, not entitlement. I sold it myself for $890,000. The money is safe beyond your reach." Paper shifted. "Consider this my parting gift, the lesson that greed locks doors while gratitude opens them." A silence with weight. Dad. David made a sound like a laugh that had been taught how to be mean. He sold it. He thinks this solves anything. This is cruel, Laura said, anger finding her like a friend. He blindsided us. He didn't even tell me. You didn't tell him, David shot back. You told me he wouldn't notice. Remember, he won't even notice we sold the place. Your words, Laura. That was you, she said, but there wasn't conviction in it. The paper shook in her hand. You said the market. I said the market was hot. You said nursing home. His voice dropped the practiced charm, stripped. You wanted Boulder, Mountain View. You did the math before you did the doddering. She inhaled like someone whose wind has been knocked out, then steadied herself on rage. He's my father, she said. He's supposed to trust me. And you're his daughter, he said. You were supposed to deserve it. Something in the house settled then. A sound like a long-held breath leaving. Maybe it was the floorboards. Maybe it was me. Laura's voice broke. Where is he? Where's he going to live? Wherever he wants, David said as if he hated the sentence, with 890,000 reasons to pick someplace without us. I never meant Laura started, and then stopped. The pages of our life itemized in her hands didn't leave much room for pretending. He could have told me she tried again the last defense of people who mistake access for ownership. He did, David said, pointing to the envelope, his jaw tight. He left you a note. I watched them sit in the living room, where I'd taught Laura to tell time by the grandfather clock. She folded the note into smaller and smaller squares until it was the size of a regret, and set it on the coffee table I'd sanded until it felt like silk. She stared at her hands as if they were new to her. David paced hands on hips, checking a phone that had no solution in it. The suitcases stood like witnesses. Mr. Hadley shuffled past my truck with his empty bin, gave me a nod that said he saw me without asking why I was there. I nodded back. The wind flipped a chime and made a single careful tone. Inside voices rose, fell, collided. There were words about leases and timing about who had promised what and when. There were smaller, truer words that don't make it into contracts, burden, deserve, father, trust. That was my cue. I turned the key. The engine caught. For a moment I watched the house I'd built hold two people who had never learned how to enter it properly. Then I eased away from the curb and let Maple Avenue lengthen ahead of me, trees shading the road the way Margaret always liked when we walked in June. The last thing I saw in the rear view was the square of my bay window catching the light and throwing it back. Some lessons don't need an audience. They only need a door that doesn't open. Saturday morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of Denver spring day when the air tastes like melted snow and new grass. I sat at the small table in my new apartment, sunlight slanting through blinds that had never known Margaret's hands. Blinds that didn't quite fit, but let the light pour in all the same. The coffee tasted different here, less like routine and more like beginning. On the nightstand across the room, Margaret's photo smiled in her steady way. Beside it sat the jewelry box. She loved the cookbook, with her handwriting the albums I couldn't leave behind. Stripped of walls and furniture, these things were no less home. In fact, they felt more honest now, free of the weight of all I'd been expected to carry. The bank transfer had cleared. $890,000 mine alone. I'd moved it to a private account David and Laura would never touch, guarded as fiercely as any safe. For the first time in years, my security wasn't tied to someone else's approval or charity. It was tied to my choices, what to keep, what to leave, what to rebuild. I took my walk after breakfast past the park 2 blocks down. Retirees fed pigeons by the benches. A boy on a scooter rattled along the sidewalk, his mother jogging to keep up. I thought about how Margaret used to say life is measured in ordinary Saturdays, not milestones. Watching the boy lean into the wind, I believed her all over again. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I didn't answer. The screen dimmed, then lit again with a text preview, "Dad, please." "We need to talk." I deleted it. For decades, my instinct had been to fix, to absorb, to forgive before apologies were offered. But forgiveness without accountability is just surrender. I wasn't surrendering anymore. At the coffee shop down the street, Brews and Views, the barista already remembered my order. "Good to see you again, Mr. Green," she said with the easy warmth of someone who wanted nothing but your name and your story, not your deeds or your account balance. I sat by the window, sipped, and read the newspaper like an ordinary man on an ordinary morning. It felt revolutionary. That afternoon I unpacked slowly, arranging Margaret's books on the shelf, stacking my tools neatly in the hall closet. I hung the photo of our wedding above the desk. It struck me that I wasn't decorating a tomb for the past. I was planting reminders in a new garden. Still, the image of Laura and David lingered, faces twisted by the note in their hands, suitcases, like anchors beside them. I didn't gloat. The satisfaction wasn't in their suffering. It was in the silence that followed in knowing I had pulled back my life from their grip. At dusk, I poured a glass of the Bordeaux Margaret and I once saved for anniversaries, carried it to the small balcony, and watched the city glow. The skyline shimmered in the distance, but closer, I could see neighbors setting out patio chairs, laughter rising faintly through the air. My hand curled around the stem of the glass, steady. I thought about the words I'd left on the note, "Greed locks doors, gratitude opens them." That wasn't just for them. It was for me, too. Gratitude had opened this door, a modest apartment, a new account mornings that belonged to no one but me. I lifted the glass to the fading light. "Here's to you, Maggie. Here's to promises finally kept." And in the hush that followed, I realized something: I wasn't anyone's burden anymore. Not theirs. Not even my own. This is where the story pauses, not because it's over, but because it's begun again. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the cost of sacrifice, of the weight of trust, of the quiet dignity of choosing your own path, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Leave your thoughts, subscribe if you wish. But most of all, carry the lesson forward. Your life is yours to keep. And sometimes the bravest act of love is drawing the lock yourself.